So now it is time for our inspirational talk this evening at our Vesper service here at Fellowships of the Spirit. And I'm so pleased to introduce or give you the forerunning of our wonderful speaker this evening, Reverend John Heppner. And he has worked for over 30 years now, studying, lecturing, and teaching about spiritual philosophy, healing, and mediumship. Ordained as a spiritualist minister in 1996 in Indiana, John continued his education and received a master's in business administration from Indiana Wesleyan University in 2006, and his doctorate in education with a specialization in organizational leadership in 2017 from North Central University of Arizona. John resides in Muncie, Indiana, where he works in the field of adult education. He brings many of the dynamic educational approaches from adult education into his spiritual work, creating an interactive and robust environment for his learners. And this evening, he will be speaking on one of our spiritual ancestors, Andrew Jackson Davis. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. You know, I was getting ready to be here, and first I want to say I'm really grateful to be here. I was here working this weekend, and the fellowship is always such a wonderful place to be, and it's been just a wonderful time for me. When I was getting ready to speak and I was thinking about Andrew Jackson Davis, I kind of looked over some notes that I had, and I thought I want to mention a few factoids of the main points of his life, but I also want to give a couple takeaways that I think are pretty important in his life and things that we might be able to relate to and take away from here and maybe, expand our own life or consciousness or our own understanding thereof. He was born in August 11th of 1826. I remember when I was a younger person in spiritualism, they said, what did Andrew Jackson Davis do? And they said he started the Lyceum movement. And I went, well, the Lyceum movement actually started the same year that he was born by a separate individual in the country, but he did start the adult Lyceum for children, and that was later on in his career. But he was born the same year the Lyceum movement took off. He was born in Blooming Grove, New York. In 1838, he moved to Poughkeepsie, and I have to say that along my time in travels, I went to Poughkeepsie because I wanted to see what the area looked like. And, eventually when they talk about him having the spontaneous trance and being transported into the Cascades, there's a high-rise bridge there, right? And I wanted to go across the high-rise bridge to see what it was like aiming in that direction. So a very interesting place to be from. In 1843, Dr. J.S. Grimes attempted to mesmerize him, but that didn't take. And I was entertained by that. I was thinking about how something that was so terribly important with where he was going spiritually, the first attempt at it was not successful at all. I was reminded of a friend of ours. We know this young gentleman in our group, and we were sitting around one day and we were watching television, and there was this group of people, and there was Christians, and they were being called to the altar and, being saved. And he looked at the TV and he said, I got saved once. It didn't take. I was thinking, well, Andrew Jackson Davis's first run, and it didn't take either. After that, a local tailor who also knew how to mesmerize people by the name of Livingston was successful in putting Davis into an altered state. So when we're thinking of mesmerism, and we're thinking of what we would modernly be calling hypnotism, if you ever get a chance, if you study the principles of Anton Mesmer, and you look at some of the things having to do with that movement of mesmerism, we have a lot of things to owe there having to do with spiritual healing, with magnetic passes. A lot of the things that we use today have their roots from that time period. And in this instance, this gentleman was able to use hypnotism and mesmerism to put Davis into an altered state. When Davis slipped into an altered state, he was able to do medical clairvoyance. And he would be able to look at people, and he would say, looking at their aura and looking at them, he would be able to see where there was imbalances and inharmonies within their body, and he was able to give them advice on how to be able to deal with those sort of things. And it ended up creating a bit of a stir that way, and he ended up working himself into the Lyceum or the lecture hall circuit of his day. In 1844, he went into that spontaneous trance that I was referring to, and he was transported around 40 miles away into the Cascades. And when he was there and he came to, he was said to have met Galen and Swedenborg, who were guiding influences for him, and they were the ones that gave him the magic staff, where we started with the quote. And I was so grateful that you said that, because I thought I was sitting there going, yeah, we're aimed in that direction. Under all circumstances, keep an even mind. In 1847, Davis, as a result of being involved in the circuit of them mesmerizing him, putting him into trance and being in the lecture halls, got a message from Spirit saying that he was going to produce a book. And so in this lecture hall, in the daytime in the lecture hall, they would be having, and in the evening time around it, they would have normal sessions where they would hypnotize him, and he would go into trance, and he would do medical clairvoyance for the audience. And then around that, they transcribed the book. And they had the two people, they had Fishbowl and Lyons. One was the doctor, and the other, Lyons, and the other one, Fishbowl, was the minister who was transcribing it. And after they hypnotized him, he would begin with, in the beginning, the univerculum was a large gaseous cloud, and the other person was writing it down line for line. And they did this, and in between, people that were coming to the lecture hall could go and inspect and look around, which is a very strange thing. And the whole book was produced that way, with them putting him into trance. And the result of that was the Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelations, which was produced in 1847. And that particular book went through, I believe from memory, 35 printings in the first 30 years that it was around. Interestingly enough, when the book was produced, Davis ended up signing away all of the rights to that book to the people who were working with him, the people that mesmerized him and wrote it down for him. The book starts with, in the beginning, the univerculum was one boundless, indefinable, and unimaginable ocean of liquid fire. What's interesting about that is that when the book was produced, what we consider today in modern physics, a lot of people have the same sort of concept about what was the beginning of the nature of the universe itself. Additionally, a piece of clairvoyance in the book, he ended up identifying a planet that wasn't there, that people didn't know about. And getting ahead of myself ever so slightly, the people that said, oh, Davis and all this talk about progression, spiritual progression, what is that with spiritual progression? The spiritual Darwinism. Darwin didn't produce that book until 1859. So using that as a detraction from is really kind of askew, because he came up with the idea long before Darwin was publishing on it. There's really a couple main ideas that I would suggest to you that are really big takeaways having to do with Davis and the things that he did. Now, I would be amiss if I didn't say that he went on from that to be prolific and produce a series of books, and there was tons of stuff that was done as a result of that, and that he was able to eventually move himself beyond the past of somebody actually putting him into trance, for him to be able to receive and go into altered states by his own volition. I think that that's a very important part of his story, and I do want to talk a bit about that. One of the first things that we think of having to do with Davis is this idea of harmony and the harmonial philosophy related to spiritualism. And when I think about that, and I think of that aspect of harmony and the harmonial philosophy, there's a quote that I found, and this comes from the magazine that he published in 1847 called the Univerculum, and I actually found this on the Dale upstairs where they have the actual Univerculum in the archives at NSAC. And I pulled this a few years ago, and I'm very fond of this one. It starts in this extent. It says, sectarianism is not in man, except for the central tendency to associate, to form groups of bodies as the planets were made, by the spontaneous gravitation of congenial parts, the sectarianism of the universe. As this is the true form of association, religious and social, he should form no other. In Davis's day, they did not have a lot of luck with organizing spiritualistic groups. People were ruggedly individualistic. And they did not end up bonding or going into groups of that section. They would talk about having spiritual affinity. And when we hear this quote about sectarianism and people getting together by having interesting and common bonds that way, that's a lot of what they were talking about. It goes on to say, in truth, I attend no church but in my mind, listen to no preacher but reason. I read no book as studiously as nature. I love no sermon as well as the well-ordered life, and believe and dream of no higher or more glorious heaven in this or any other sphere than the harmonious adaptation of one spirit to another, and all to the great Spirit Father. The idea of harmony, harmony within your being, harmony within your body, harmony within your family, harmony extending out to the community, harmony extending out to the globe, begins with you, and harmony begins at home. As we bring our body into alignment, as we bring ourself into alignment, and still talking about the harmonial philosophy, his ideas and that which was created from him and the philosophy is what eventually came to be the Declaration of Principles and all the things that people formed after these things were done. Before we had the Declaration of Principles and spiritualism, we had the harmonial philosophy. It was the original deal. And it's worth noting that and looking back upon our history with that. I want to talk a little bit about progression with Davis, because I think it's an important part of what he talked about as well. With Davis, the whole business about spiritual communication and the idea about continuity of life didn't just tell us that this is terrific, that we know that those people have gone on and that life continues. It also told us that we had our own progression to be concerned with. The idea that we had realized that since there was a spiritual being that is moving on, so do we have our own spiritual being in its ongoing progression and evolution, and that we should be working for its highest and best good. I mentioned earlier the detractors said, well, that's spiritual Darwinism, and we're just busy dogging him. But I still think that this idea of us reaching higher and moving for greater goals is something that's worth looking at, and it's an important part of the whole legacy that he leaves for us. The other thing that we would want to think about with natural law, it comes from another quote that I'd give to you from Davis, and this is also on his topic of that, having to do with natural law. Search the scriptures of nature, the handiwork of the firmament, for in there you'll find the holy truths of eternal life. To understand the apocalyptic glories of the universe, study the genesis of this God-inspired volume. Whosoever questions nature aright reads truly those scriptures which teach of God and eternity. As spiritualists, as searchers for eternal life, let us contemplate nature in man and woman, nature in God, and therefore God in nature. The whole business about looking at things in a natural way and applying spiritual principles and attempting to align ourselves that way punctuates itself throughout his literature. When there's a section when he talks about progression, and he mentions, and this is kind of an interesting concept, he says, notice what happens with iron. If you leave it out there in the elements, it begins to oxidize and rust grows, and eventually it moves itself into a new form and it's not lost. If we think about when we leave a body and we leave behind our physical body and the spirit moves on, that there's nothing that's lost in the traces of things that we do. So that whole concept about studying nature and applying it to philosophical concepts really punctuates itself through Davis. I think sometimes people find it difficult to pick up and read Davis, and I think that sometimes people overlook that. But I think if you have anybody that has the ability to be able to give you pieces like that, that there's a way to relate to the shoulders that we stand on and to be able to apply some ideas from it. Later in his life, in his 60s or so, Davis ended up going on to medical school and became a real doctor. As far as those things go, a real doctor, he got himself a degree. I joke about that, right? Because, you know, people that go off and get an honorarium degree versus people that are really getting beaten up in the educational system, and I know a little something about what that's like. You know, he went off to school and became a doctor, and for whatever reason that happened, you know, I was talking to somebody just the other day, the end of the 1800s that way, there was a lot of people that were involved in New Thought and had come out of spiritualism and went on into college and started getting degrees, and it was really very trendy in the group that he ran with. I have to give credit to my own life that in the same sense, after I had settled down and gotten a lot of healing and integration from spiritualism, that's when I really started springboarding off and doing a lot of education myself. And I really think that there's value in that. I think it's noble that he went on in that direction. He ended up getting out of the marriage that he'd been involved with for years and got involved with somebody new and had a whole new chapter in the last part of his life, and ended up writing the second part of the autobiography where he even challenged spiritualists to make sure that they were striving for higher life, that they were trying to do more than just be entertained by spirits, that they were trying to reach higher. And I think that there's a lot of very interesting things in the center of that. You know, there's a line from an old spiritualist magazine from the 1800s. It was called Banner of Light, and their motto was onward and upward. And when I think of Davis, I frequently think in that direction about the onward and upward, that we continue to reach, that we continue to grow, and that there's new vistas for us to find. And I hope that some of these thoughts about Davis inspire some thought on your own spiritual journey wherever you are at right now. And I was very grateful that I was asked to come and join you, and I hope I've provided some insights for you there. God bless you all.